He's here. Observe. Oh, you're so heavy. Oh, bad timing. Oh no! It's okay! Alright, I tried recording this video yesterday. It didn't work out so well. Hi, Gelatinous Rube here. Ignore the mess, my mess, everything. I'm not feeling great today, but I did promise to get a video out today, so I'm doing it. There was a conversation yesterday on Twitter about, somebody asking a perfectly innocent, normal question: how do we handle character death in a long-standing campaign? We've had a long-standing campaign. It's mostly been the same characters. We haven't had a character death as of yet. We find out later that these people have actually prepared for character death a little bit, but they're still curious. What do other people do, right? How do other people handle character death? When a campaign has been going for a long time, you have some degree of the campaign that is for long periods of time static. Perfectly reasonable question. Doesn't really matter what kind of campaign you're playing. Even in a grand campaign like my own, you can occasionally get more static assortments, like more static parties over longer periods of time. Adventuring space, you could say. There's a number of different ways that we could apply this question to our games regardless of the style. And so my thought is, hey, I should probably figure out a way to answer this question that's relevant to my campaign style. The right way to, which is of course the right way to play, right? I want to proselytize for my style of play while I have the opportunity. There's no reason for me not to do that. But I'm doing it while giving advice. I'm going to switch screens here. We're going to do minimal editing today. Here we go. Last night we had a character die. Alright, they've had somebody die. We know this information. The campaign has been 20 weeks long at this point, and the party has been through a mind-blowing emotional journey. To some degree, we could infer that this has been something of a static arrangement between the parties so far. And then our question to GMs, and this is a two-parter: how do you introduce a character into a long campaign, step 1, and part 2, and make them feel like they belong to the plot? Well, that's relevant. I've solidified my range of correct answers, and which I would have loved to focus on, but now I'm forced to also kind of focus on definitions of useful answers. But let's focus on the range of correct answers here. We want to get the characters in the party immediately, right away. Professor Dungeon Master had a great response, which I will pull up in a moment. I know that some people have been making fun of Professor Dungeon Master recently. I don't know why, because he didn't struggle with this question whatsoever. ASAP, no later than the, how did I mess that up? No later than the first scene of the next session, even if it does not make sense in terms of plot. It's a game, not a book. If Lord of the Rings were a game, I'd have Faramir show up right after Boromir's death. I think the question behind the question is, this transition feels a little weird to us, even when we take this more straightforward approach. Is there a way to smooth this transition out? And so I think a range of proper answers is one, the weirdness is going to evaporate quickly, okay? Because it's still Bob sitting next to you. And so you've gone from the game having Bob as a participant, briefly not having Bob as a participant, and then having Bob as a participant again. And so the distraction of Bob briefly not participating will quickly fade. And it's really not that big of a deal. Fine, perfect. And then on the other side of this range of acceptable experiences is, alright, we have the idea that the players are going to, or this new player, might have some kind of secret information about the local adventure site that's relevant to the player's personal current objectives, right? Or maybe a side objective. So a magic item, magic item, monster, NPC rescue, or treasure in need of recovery. And technically an NPC in need of rescue is kind of treasure, right? It's a check, if you will, because obviously you have to ransom them back in some fashion. This is all perfectly correct advice because it's all actionable. It's within a range of correct explanations or a range of correct answers, which focus on getting the player character back into the fight as quickly as possible, and either having a neutral or positive impact on the game's momentum. I don't know if I would demand a positive impact of character death on the game's momentum. That seems like something a little bit more context dependent, but it's not contradicting the neutral impact on the game's momentum of just, alright, have them show up next scene. This is, some people had an issue giving this a correct, simple answer, where folks started focusing on this dumb word, plot. Why does your game have a central plot, especially one that can't withstand the death of a character? Nowhere in this tweet was that ever even remotely implied. There's no reason to think it whatsoever. Fundamentally flawed framing on 2 levels. It's not that, 1, characters don't belong to the plot. Characters create the plot by their actions and choices. Correct. Step 1. That's correct. So now the question behind this person's question, let's say they change and they say, okay, you're right, characters don't belong to the plot, characters create the plot. Well, how do I fit in this new character with the plot that the old characters created? Now we're back to square one. So this is dog shit. Don't phrase advice like this. And then 2, it's not the DM's job to solve the player's problems. It's up to the players to contrive a solution to adding a new character. Now, there are 2 possible interpretations of this. I think one of which is wrong, and one of which is within the range of correct answers that I posed earlier. Here we go. Perfect. So, let's assume that players can contrive an answer, but not the context. So they can say, okay, we're going to fix the problem to not having this character around in the same way that we would fix not having an NPC around or not having a hireling around. So we have to use spells to request backup. We need to put notices up in town. We need to try our hand at hiring for a few weeks and whatever, right? And so this would be actionable advice. I think it's the wrong advice. But number 2 is players contrive an answer and context. So they decide where, when, and under what circumstances the new player character is going to appear in the next scene. Or whenever it is that they decide, right? Maybe they decide, no, your new character is not going to show up right now. We are traveling to Innistrad or whatever. And that's where your character will appear, right? Once we get to the gates, once we get to the portal, your character will be directly on the other side. So get ready, Bob. Right? And I think that is actionable and correct. And I really wish that Mr. Wargaming had given this answer. I don't actually think he was giving... some people think that he wasn't giving advice. In my Discord, I had a long argument with somebody who said, no, this was advice, and it was very good advice, and it met all my criteria for advice prior. I did a video ages ago called Why Game Master Advice Sucks. And it was because people refuse, at risk, because they don't want to risk being wrong, they will just give you these dumb platitudes. And something I've noticed recently is, as the Broas are, as like the people who are more invested in kind of a aggressive, high testosterone, however you want to phrase it, RPG advice and RPG gaming, we are starting to develop some of our own dumb platitudes. And I don't mind platitudes that much because they're short. They're supposed to be shortcuts to getting to a correct answer, right? That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, except if we go back. This is my problem with the advice that this is my problem with these 2 different options, these 2 different interpretations of John Mollison's advice. These 2 pieces of advice, both of which would be like perfectly actionable, one of which would be wrong, but both of them are actionable, so at the very least the Last Tavern folks can playtest it and decide for themselves. These are mutually exclusive interpretations of the same advice. So internalizing the advice can't happen because there are mutually exclusive interpretations. And to start delving into these different interpretations takes you back to square one. So it's useless. And you don't need to do that process if you're actually trying to give this person advice. Because clearly you can phrase it like I've done here. The point is the advice, right? So how is the person going to implement this in their game? Is there anything that we're not addressing? Is there anything that we're intentionally not addressing, right? That's not a problem. But what we want is a heuristic, a standard, a baseline for this person to follow when character death happens. And we would say either the DM will refuse. Here's one. In number one, the DM refuses to introduce a new character whatsoever, which is weird. Number two is the DM will not introduce them because the players will introduce them without DM input. I like number two. I don't know if I would necessarily go with number two, but it's really attractive. Anything that lets me be more lazy is really attractive. Anything that lets me be lazy and also doesn't let the players play is not attractive because that's not gaming, right? That's cheating, functionally. Option number one is cheating. We have an understanding that player characters are going to come into the game, right? And if somebody dies, then there will be new crops of player characters. It's assumed as a baseline, which is why we don't have a ton of text explaining why player characters or how player characters make it into the dungeon if somebody has previously died, because it's just assumed. And so if I flip this on its head with no prior warning and no explanation and really no way around it, I have cheated. Because I've taken a game element and changed the way it works in contradiction with how the game is intended to function and how the players are intended to function within the game, how they're supposed to interact with the game. Because if they knew that, alright, players can contrive an answer but not context, well, then they might have done these hiring downtime actions to begin with and taken spare player characters along that lets them call back people from, base camp outside the dungeon. That would be okay, but that's not the understanding of the game. I'll just say now, that's not the game, right? The DM does introduce player characters. If you would like to offload that responsibility of introducing the player characters and just let the PCs, if you just want to let the PCs, decide how Bob gets back in instead of you deciding how Bob gets back in, I'm totally fine with that. If I had to guess, that's probably closer to what John's interpretation, Mr. Wargaming's interpretation would be. I might put this in the Grand Campaign playlist. I have not decided as of yet. I should decide. I'm supposed to upload it in the next half hour. Good question. Do I have any other Grand Campaign relevant advice to give here to kind of give myself an excuse? The difference between Grand Campaigns and conventional campaigns often really is not whether or not you start in a tavern or whether you have a hot start or the types of content you engage with overall. It's the way in which the campaign scales to allow and encourage to demand even new contributors enter the campaign. Treat character death as an opportunity, a demand on the part of the game to let in new contributors to the game. The more you get used to handling these emergencies or hiccups or disruptions to a plot or a storyline or whatever have you, to focus on the emergent narrative, the emergent play, and the emergent sandbox coming from these little emergencies. They're no longer seen as, they're still failure states in a sense, in that personal failure or even party failure has happened, and they're going to face consequences for it, but it's not the end of the game, right? That's the difference between these failure states. It's the end of a thread. It's the end of a plot. That's fine. But the more you focus, the more prepared you get. There's a cat over here. The more prepared you get to just kind of deal with these things as they come along, the less you have to worry about it interfering with a plot or a storyline, because you're going to be less invested in a plot or storyline overall. Just like how your first adventure, where you Take something that is largely conventional, you take a plot, a thread, adventure thread, that is meant to scale and optimize to scale as time goes on, if the players choose to engage with it, or maybe even if they don't choose to engage with it, to just modify their engagements later on. My cat just tripped like a bird, that was so weird. Ah! Do you have any other salient commentary for us? He doesn't. I want to encourage you to treat character death in a similar fashion, to where this can move the campaign forward, or at the very least, it doesn't have to set the campaign back. Oh, you're stretching out here. Yes. Right, Norwegian forest cat or Persian mix or whatever the hell you are. Look at him. Look at my little snaggletooth. Look at the baby boy. Where is he? You here? He's here. Observe. Oh, you're so heavy. Oh, bad timing. Oh no! It's okay!